Fantasy Foresight. Fantasy Foresight. Fantasy Foresight. Welcome everyone to Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We're your hosts and co-founders of FantasyForesight.com, coming to you from the Rambo Fixture Company studios. I'm Ben.
And I'm Jay.
You ready to get rolling, Jay?
You know it. Let's do this.
All right, let's go. Welcome in, everyone. It is Thursday, October 10th, and we are back with you for Week 6 buys and sells versus their aggregate projections. We're here to turn it around this week at Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We've had a couple of rough weeks, and we are ready to hit it big. I'm not calling any shots, but I'm ready to have a nice victory week. How you doing tonight, Jay?
Ben, I am glad that you asked. Week 6 fantasy football, fantasy gods, can we have some normalcy, please? I feel like we've had a pretty good handle heading into each week, knowing in advance of whether or not it's going to be something we come to expect or if it's going to be a wild and crazy week. I'm looking across the board. I've got some great matchups in fantasy. They should be cakewalks. I know I shouldn't expect that. But come on, man. Just let me have an easy weekend for once. We've got some crucial matchups in our Canton Fantasy League, in our Fanalist Premier League matchups. It's a big week, man. And I'm looking at a lot of these injuries, and I'm seeing a lot of possibility for some crazy performances, and I don't like that. Fantasy gods, please. We've got a great list for you listeners tonight. Let this happen. Steve, how are you doing, my friend?
Well, let's just say that I'm not even kidding, guys. Tuesday morning, my wife woke me up in my sleep in the middle of the night because she thought I was having a nightmare. And when I told her what I was dreaming about, I was arguing with a coworker about why the Browns were struggling. I'll just leave it at that. But yeah, I'm doing okay given the circumstances.
All right, man, let's get this fired up. This list tonight is fantastic. I am fired up and ready to rack up wins and accuracy in Week 6. Let's go.
Yes, sir. First up, we've got Seattle Seahawks quarterback Russell Wilson. He is this week's aggregate projected QB7, and Total Foresight likes him as QB4. He is on the road at the Cleveland Browns at 1 p.m. Sunday. He's got the 5th best QB Foresight strength of schedule this week, and Vegas likes Seattle as a 1.5-point favorite, and the over-under in that game is 46.5, so there are some points expected to be scored. And on the season, did you know that Russell Wilson is QB1 in overall fantasy points per game? Look out for Seattle. This team typically starts slow and picks up steam as the season moves on. Well, they didn't even start slow this year. Browns are going to have to be at their best to have a shot against fantasy's QB1 overall so far in 2019.
Ben, I had to double check your stats. I did not believe that Russell Wilson is QB1 overall in fantasy this year, and he is. More points than Patrick Mahomes, 40 less passes, 400 fewer passing yards, more touchdowns, better efficiency. He's averaging 73% completion percentage. The dude has been a baller. What? I mean, if you took a shot on Russell Wilson later in drafts than taking Mahomes early, he has paid off for you big time. Love this pick, and I look forward to seeing him keep it rolling. Next up, we've got a redemption possibility this week. Mark Ingram. Come on, man. Running back for the Baltimore Ravens. He is currently aggregate projected as RB14. We have him in Total Foresight as RB4 this week. Home against the Cincinnati Bengals. They have the best running back Foresight strength of schedule this week. Baltimore is favored by 11. They should be leading this game and want to kill the clock and control the game flow. The over-under is 48. Ben, you just said it. The over-under in the other game was 46.5. Points will be scored. He is RB9 in points per game on the season. So he was chosen by the numbers and not us in Week 6. As Tosh would say, this is a true Foresight podcast web redemption for Mark Ingram this week. Last week, all you had to do was best RB17, and we all know how that went. But with the best running back Foresight strength of schedule in Week 6, odds are still on our side to best his RB14 level this week.
Yeah, I was really shocked to see Mark Ingram fall short last week, and we're hoping for better days ahead. All the numbers point to a bounce back week for him. He's aggregate projected RB14, and I like his chances. Next up, we have Dallas Cowboys wide receiver Michael Gallup on our list. He is currently aggregate projected wide receiver 19. Total Foresight likes him as wide receiver 13. The Cowboys are on the road at the New York Jets at 4:25 p.m. on Sunday. They have the sixth best wide receiver Foresight strength of schedule this week. Dallas is a 7-point favorite. Over-under on that game is very similar to what we've already discussed at 45 points. And in 3 games this season, Michael Gallup, guys, is wide receiver 7 in fantasy points per game. He played in week 1, 2, and 5. His finishes were wide receiver 15, wide receiver 35, and wide receiver 11. So 2 of those 3 games he's played, he's been a top 15 wide receiver. And in a bounce back type of scenario for the entire Dallas Cowboys team this week, I definitely like his chances at doing better than wide receiver 19.
Well, and I'll tell you what, that Dallas offense sure looked different with him in the lineup versus him out of the lineup. So he may be a key piece to letting this machine roll and hum along, and it could spell good things for that Dallas offense against the Jets. Love that pick. All right, moving up to maybe one of the fantasy MVPs so far of this year. Wide receiver DJ Chark of the Jacksonville Jaguars. His current aggregate projection is WR17. We have him ranked in Total Foresight as WR9. He is home against the Saints at 1 p.m. on Sunday. The Jags actually have the 7th best wide receiver Foresight strength of schedule ranking this week. The Jags are favored by 1 at home against the Saints. Over under 43.5 points. This is where it gets amazing for Mr. Chark. On the season, he is WR5 in points per game. So far, in 5 weeks, he has finished WR11, WR13, WR20, WR43, and then back to WR4. Our analytics say he has the best odds of any WR2 this week to meet or exceed his aggregate projection. We talk about how difficult it is to be consistent at the wide receiver position in fantasy football, and DJ Chark has been the tentpole of consistency so far this season. He has been the mark to beat. Who saw that coming?
Not me. No, just like nobody saw Uncle Rico Gardner Minshew coming either. I mean, those two definitely have a connection, and it's fun to watch, that's for sure. Moving on to one more repeat this week. For our last bye for week 6, we have got Atlanta Falcons tight end Austin Hooper making our list again. He is aggregate projected tight end 4, and Total Foresight likes him as tight end 2. The Falcons are on the road at Arizona at 4:05 p.m. on Sunday, and Austin Hooper has the 3rd best Foresight strength of schedule this week. The Falcons are a 2.5-point favorite. Over-under in that game is 51.5. And guys, did you know who's the tight end 1 overall and in fantasy points per game this year? His name's Austin Hooper. Of all the aggregate projected tight end 1s this week, our analytics say he has the best odds to meet or exceed his aggregate projection, period. So we could not leave him off this list.
I'm giving him a new nickname. It is now Austin Take It to the Bank Hooper. Let's go.
Yeah.
He's one guy I can count on. And after looking at our buys this week, there is one common thing. I see Vegas expecting lots of scoring in these matchups, which I love to see. You got to have that. And I see a lot of potential out of these guys to score fantasy points. Steve, what do you think of our buys this week? Be honest.
Hey, and that's what I want to say, guys, at least for our listeners out there. I want you to know that, like, you know, Ben and Jay have me on the podcast every Thursday night to kind of go over, you know, some speculative ads and also, you know, give a little bit of my input on these buys and sells. And I don't usually see this list until shortly before we get on and record the podcast. So I just want you to know this is genuinely my thoughts and opinions. And man, I love the web redemption with Mark Ingram. I loved him last week, but this week there's even more to love, guys. The Cincinnati Bengals have given up the 2nd most rushing yards per game in the NFL so far through 5 weeks of the NFL season. This is at home, hosting Cincy. There's no reason that Mark Ingram can't explode in this ball game. So I'm right there with you guys. I am all over him. The one pick that does give me caution is definitely DJ Chark. And the main reason is Marshawn Lattimore will be all over him, and he has held Mike Evans and Amari Cooper to a combined 48 yards the last 2 weeks. So he definitely is going to have his work cut out for him, but I obviously understand why he's on this list. It just, for me, I'd be surprised if he even finishes as WR17.
And peek behind the curtain, Steve, it's a great point that you make there. We tweaked our process a little bit this week, trying to take emotion out of it even that much more and trying to trust the numbers, trust the analytics, trust the matrix that is Total Foresight. And this is one of those picks that in prior weeks, when we bring in our knowledge of the game and your point about Marshawn Lattimore, I might use that as a reason to leave him off this list. So it's going to be really interesting to watch what happens when we just go by the numbers more.
Perfect segue into our first sell of the week, Ben.
Yeah, and you've got Arizona Cardinals quarterback Kyler Murray, another guy that I would not normally select this week, but our analytics tell us that of all the aggregate projected QB1s, the top 12 aggregate projected QBs in fantasy this week, he has the least chance of returning on his aggregate projection of QB5 of any quarterback. And so again, just because he's at home versus that Falcons defense, normally, and he's got the 8th best quarterback foresight strength of schedule this week, normally I'm not going to choose to put him on this list, but tweaking our process and going just strictly by the metrics, he lands here. So it will be very interesting to see home versus the Falcons at 4:00 on Sunday. If Atlanta, 2.5 point favorite, over under 51.5 points, can hold Kyler Murray to be less than an aggregate projection of QB5. For the record, Total Foresight likes him as QB8, and his average points per game on the season is QB9.
Well, and part of the reason why offensive players going against Atlanta, receivers and quarterbacks, don't have as strong of strength of schedule metric as you would expect is teams don't have to pass the ball against the Falcons to be successful. You can run on that team and control the ball, and then they play catch up. So you're in control the whole game. So that's why, we had a pick last week. We have a pick this week going against the Falcons where you're thinking, what are you talking about? That's a fantasy gem, but sometimes it doesn't work out that way. All right, moving on to our next guy, New York Jets running back. Lev Bell makes our sell list this week. His aggregate projection is RB4. His total foresight rank is RB10. The Jets are home against Dallas at 425. The Jets running backs have the second worst running back foresight strength of schedule this week. Dallas is favored. Under-over is 45. Lev Bell is RB10 in points per game on the season, but this is another DeAndre Hopkins kind of situation that we saw last week. Obviously, you start Lev Bell. There's no question. But you need to do so with managed expectations. He'll be more of a back-end RB1 than a high-end RB1 this week. So make your other easy for me to say, Ben, sit decisions accordingly.
Thank you. That will not be edited out. Our next sell of the week is Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receiver. A lot of guys on my league of record on this sell list this week. Tampa Bay wide receiver Mike Evans. He is the aggregate projected wide receiver 10. Total Foresight liked him as wide receiver 15. He's at home versus the Carolina Panthers. Everybody remember, the Panthers and the Bucks play early this week in London. Starts at 9:30 a.m. our time. So if you have any Bucks, you have any Panthers, make sure you're doing your due diligence and looking them up a little bit earlier and definitely on Saturday night.
So they're at home.
Technically, they're at home versus the Panthers in London. So that's always one of those cheap, quote, home games every year. But Vegas likes the Panthers as a 2.5 point favorite. Over-unders 47.5. Mike Evans on the season really has only had that one monster week and done nothing else any other week, including an entire goose egg last week. Still, despite all of that, he is wide receiver 22 overall in points per game. Had this conversation on this podcast, off this podcast. If you're somebody with Mike Evans, What are you going to do or drop or get for him that has better upside than him right now? If you are somebody that has Mike Evans on your roster, this is the time to stay the course, to have some courage, and to trust that he is going to bounce back like he has done every other season that he's been in the NFL. Has he had a turbulent start to the fantasy season? Absolutely. But this week, his aggregate projection is wide receiver 10. Total Foresight likes him as wide receiver 15. He is still a top-end fantasy talent. So just, again, this is more about a managed expectations type of situation this week. Mike Evans could do what Mike Evans has done the majority of the season, which is absolutely nothing. But we definitely know one thing. We don't like him to be wide receiver 10 this week.
No, our analytics say he has the worst odds to live up to his aggregate projection this week out of all the wide receiver 2s. All right, let's move on to our next guy, the MVP of Week 5. He won you a lot of contests and possibly some money. Houston Texans wide receiver Will Fuller, the best ball star. His aggregate projection is currently WR16, his total foresight rank, WR22. They are at Kansas City at 1 o'clock. They have the 15th best wide receiver foresight strength of schedule this week. Kansas City favored only by 4.5 against the Texans, with the over-under at a nice paltry 55. Will Fuller, with his one monster week, is WR10 this season in points per game. Be careful overreacting to Will Fuller this week. Was he crazy and bonkers? The WR1 overall last week? Yes, absolutely he was. But remember, this is a boom and bust kind of guy. Here are his weekly finishes this year aside from last week's WR1 overall finish. WR60, WR59, WR48, and WR63. That's consistently bad. Okay? With those finishes, I'd understand if you went a different direction last week and missed out on his monster game. So now all of a sudden he's supposed to be WR16 this week. Don't chase the points. Take the under.
Yep, very well said, Jay. This week, it's one of those overreaction type of deals. I don't see him being able to deliver a top 16 wide receiver performance this week. And even if he ends as a back end wide receiver 2, kind of like Total Foresight projects him, it's all about managed expectations. Everybody's trying to make start-sit decisions here, and we just want to advise you accordingly. Sometimes you don't have any better options, and you just got to roll the dice. But sometimes if you're teetering, hopefully we give you that one piece of information that helps you make that decision. Our last sell of the week is Tennessee Titans tight end Delanie Walker. He is currently the tight end 12 as far as aggregate projections go this week. Total Foresight likes him as tight end 17 heading into week 6. The Titans are on the road at Denver at 4:25 p.m. And Delanie has the second worst tight end Foresight strength of schedule this week. Denver is a 2.5-point favorite. Over-under is 40.5 points, a little bit lower than some of the other over-unders that you've heard us discuss this week. And on the season, Delanie Walker is a fringe tight end 1. He is tight end 12 overall and average fantasy points per game. His best week of the season was week 1 against our Browns, Steve. He was tight end 4 week 1, then tight end 13, tight end 10. In the last 2 weeks, he was only tight end 53 and tight end 39. So with that super tough tight end foresight strength of schedule this week, our analytics say Delanie has the worst chance of any aggregate projected tight end 1 of living up to his tight end 12 overall projection.
Steve, what do you think of the sells this week?
Well, Jay, funny you ask me that, because I have to be honest, when I initially looked at these, I thought, why are we selling Kyler Murray, giving everything that goes into that matchup? Atlanta giving up all the points they give up. But then, Jay, you made an excellent point that Arizona doesn't necessarily have to just drop back and throw it 50 times. They could pound salt with DJ this week, and they can dictate the game to Atlanta. And then Atlanta can do what they usually do when they're 2-3 scores behind, and Matt Ryan and gang, rack up their points. So, there's going to be a lot of points, a lot of fantasy points. But, I'm questioning myself about disliking the Kyler Murray pick. But I have to say the one pick that the sell that I like the most on here, guys, Will Fuller.
Yeah.
For all the reasons that you give. But then also, I don't think a lot of people understand just how hard it is as an opposing offense, especially an opposing quarterback, to go into Arrowhead and put up points. It's an extremely hard place to play, guys. So I feel like that entire offense, their fantasy floor is lowered. And I don't know, guys. It also might be time for DeAndre Hopkins to finally get his. I don't see WR16 at all out of Will Fuller, not whatsoever.
You make a great point. One of our guys, Matt Williams, I just saw tweeted earlier today that says your gut feeling of somebody that's going to go off this week in week 6 is blank. And it's funny you mentioned DeAndre Hopkins, Steve, because that's exactly who popped into my mind. And that would be at the detriment of Will Fuller, on top of him being consistently unreliable every single week this season except last week. Yeah. All right. Well, that wraps up our buys and sells versus aggregate projections for week 6. So now if you have a roster spot, a guy on the end of your bench that with a limited upside that you're probably going to drop in favor of somebody with more upside on the waiver wire next week, consider dropping them early and picking up a free agent as a speculative stash. You never know how the fantasy week's going to shake out. So if somebody could potentially have an injury in front of this guy or something like that, you might be able to capitalize for free before he's the primary waiver ad heading into the next week. So, Steve, who are a couple of your speculative stashes heading into week 6?
Well, gentlemen, it's kind of funny because I would say, okay, if you go to fantasyforesight.com every Friday evening and you do, check out the column I put out there with my speculative stashes, I do stress every single week that if nothing else, pick up a high value handcuff or handcuff the best running back you have on your roster, because likely that's your most valuable position on your fantasy squad. And with that being said, until this past weekend, I don't think we knew who Run CMC's handcuff was until this past weekend. And now I would say with confidence that I think we'd all agree, Reggie Bonifon, he showed out. CMC had to step out for a minute, and dude came in 5 carries, 80 yards, including a 59-yard touchdown run. Skill set very similar to Run CMC's. Obviously, he's not Christian McCaffrey, but we're talking about high-value handcuff stashes that you want to have. Definitely somebody you want to keep in mind. And to go along with that thought process, Christian McCaffrey's had 136 touches through 5 games, guys. Yeah. That would be 435 touches this season is his pace, which would be 13th most all time. Not saying the man can't hold up and possibly get through the season, but, when you're thinking about how much Carolina is riding that horse, certainly, if you own CMC, you need to pick this guy up. And if you're looking for a high-value kind of handcuff, a guy you want to throw on the end of your bench, see what happens. If Christian McCaffrey makes it through each and every week, definitely pick up Reggie. And then really quick, this guy isn't so much a guy you want to stash, but when I was looking back over the guys I talked about for the waiver wire pickups on Monday, I just want to kind of backtread a little bit and talk about Preston Williams. I know I talk about this guy a lot, but once again, he is somebody who is going up against the Washington Redskins, who have given up the most fantasy points to wide receivers this entire season. He's been targeted by Josh Rosen, a team leading 19 times for the Miami Dolphins. They're coming off a bye week. If you need somebody this week to plug and play either in your flex or in your WR3 spot, he is somebody who is 12% owned. You can go out, pick this guy up, throw him in your lineup. He's probably going to give you an 8 to 10 point PPR floor. And, maybe he has the best game of his young career. You never know.
Love it, Steve. All right. Well, that wraps up this episode of Fantasy Foresight, the podcast, and we will be back with you on Monday Night Football to discuss our accuracy and hits and misses. And
all hits.
Hopefully we have things to celebrate and not more frustration, but all you can do in fantasy football is keep grinding, don't panic, and that's what we're doing. So enjoy the week of football, everybody, and we will do the same. We'll be back with you on Monday night. Can't wait.
And that wraps up this episode of Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We thank you for joining us. Be sure to visit us, as always, at fantasyforesight.com. Use the links at the bottom of the page to find us across social media, including Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and wherever you pod. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you next time.